Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to this webinar looking at electricity storage. The idea of the webinar, we're just going to give a brief introduction into electricity storage specifically, look at some of the drivers and hence how that's leading to some of the business models. I'll show one or two examples and also talk about, mention very briefly, some of the alternatives to energy storage, electricity storage. Just to introduce myself, I'm doing this on behalf of Green Power Academy, supporting an electricity storage training course that we run. My name is John Massey. I'm a director of Greycells Energy, company that I founded. I've got quite a long history with Green Power Academy. I was one of the founders of that back in 2008, so I still work with them to deliver training courses as well as offering training and analysis services through my own company, Greycells Energy nowadays. My focus is on clean power systems and the transition really, so particularly renewable power and also flexibility, so some of the flexibility solutions that we're going to need to have in a system that incorporates quite a lot of renewable power. And within that, my focus has been on helping non-engineers understand both the market competition and also the economics that new technologies bring into, in this case, energy systems. I've got over 15 years of training experience and over 25 years of experience commercially as an industry analyst and business trainer within the industry. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get on with the webinar itself. I guess just before I do that, I've got to remind you that you'll get a recording of this webinar. Jamie from Green Power Academy will send that out after the webinar. Also, you can ask questions. The best way to do that is there should be a little chat window. If you type your questions in, I'm not going to cover them as I go along, but we'll select one or two at the end to hopefully have a go answering. Okay. So, excuse me, what's driving interest in storage? I actually presented and wrote a very short storage course as far back as 2010, I think it was. Now, obviously in recent years, particularly the last couple of years, the interest in storage has grown as exponentially as the storage deployments itself has. Now, we could pick out lots of drivers for this. Really, it's around flexibility, so having power systems which are not only clean but are also flexible, and that flexibility need has been driven in particular by the growth of variable renewable energy, solar and wind particularly, which people regard as intermittent as another term you'll hear. Basically, how do you balance things that supply power when nature demands, which is not necessarily when I demand it to cook my dinner, drill a hole in the wall, or whatever else I'm trying to do. So that whole balancing supply and demand is obviously a key one in systems where we're introducing more sources of supply which are not controllable to the extent we've had before. A lot of these other drivers also kind of come together, they fit with that. What we've been seeing in a number of systems is the costs of peak power going up. So the cost of electricity on wholesale markets at peak times of demand going up, and also volatility. So a bigger variation between prices at peak times and prices at non-peak times. You may have seen quite a few reports over recent months and over the last year or so around negative pricing. So times of day when demand is very low, we've actually got excess supply and we're actually paying people to take electricity. Now, both spikes in price at peak times and negative prices at times of low demand are signs of an inflexible system. We clearly don't want to be in a situation where electricity is worth less than nothing. We've actually got to pay people to take it. So addressing that is part of the whole flexibility regime. There's quite a lot of interest and quite a lot of economic benefit for operators of the grid system, be that the transmission system, the high capacity bit in the middle, or the distribution system, the kind of low voltage power lines taking power to your home. Now, one of the issues within grid systems over the years, and still, is that we've always tended to build everything sized for peak demands. As we'll see, when we grow variable renewables, one of the challenges with growing variable renewables is that for the same amount of energy generation over a period of time, we need to build a lot of capacity. And so we're having issues, or we're going to have certainly issues increasing going forwards, not only of what do we do when the wind doesn't blow, but also overcapacity. What happens when the wind is blowing too much? What happens when there's too much sun? We've already seen situations of that in markets like California, for example, most recently, in Germany for a few years. So the grid also comes into that. What we've also encountered problems with is curtailment. So not having a situation where there's not enough demand for our power, but just not being able to move it about. So generating it in one place, we've got to move it through the grid to get it to where it's needed. If we've got too much capacity in one place and the grid hasn't caught up, then we have a problem. Storage potentially provides a solution for that by, rather than constantly upgrading the grid to higher capacity, instead storing the energy when it's generated and delivering it when those lines are not fully loaded. So that's a big driver. Along with that, and particularly with regard to the distribution network, we've got this growth of distributed generation. We're kind of moving away from systems where we had a few very large power plants pushing power out to the edges of the network when people demanded it. And instead, we're starting to see the growth of distributed generators, small generators positioned where the demand is, at people's houses, on business rooftops, wherever it may be. That not only is a big change in the whole business model of the system, but also there are some specific issues it's creating. For example, moving power from the edge of the system into the system, which it was never designed for. Again, we've seen some problems on distribution lines around voltage levels and so on, which again, storage can have a role in solving. And tied around with all this flexibility is what I've kind of rather generically called the growth of smart systems. Now, we could have a whole series of webinars on what a smart system is, but here, I suppose in particular, one key change of smart systems is systems where if our supply is going to be variable, rather than allowing our demand to do what it wants, a smart system will also aim to balance supply and demand by adjusting demand as well. And as we'll see, storage is quite unique compared to our kind of traditional sources of flexibility in how it can handle both supply and demand. And then from a economic point of view, so those top ones, if you like, are kind of technical reasons and market reasons why we need more flexibility. There are others, but let's pick those main ones. But at the same time, as luck would have it, in particular with batteries, we've seen big reductions in cost, not driven by the energy industry so much, but driven by consumer electronics, mobile phones, laptops, etc., and then more recently electric vehicles, cars. So this combination of a greater need for flexibility, driven by wanting cleaner power systems with more solar and wind in them, and at the same time reducing battery costs, is kind of bringing the two together. And all of that obviously then piques investor interest. If returns are dropping in other investments, then as they mature, then obviously the storage market is one that's of great interest to them. So there's a whole bunch of drivers, and as with any market system, any competitive environment, it's not just a technology, it's not just an application, it's the combination of technology growth, market need, investor interest, and the economics, the costs of doing this, and also the benefits, the value of achieving it, that's come together to drive a market. Also, I mean, I've mentioned battery there. The key thing to stay at this very early stage, of course, is that storage is not just about batteries. They're very heavily in the news, but the vast majority of electricity storage in our systems at the moment is what we call pumped storage, hydro, pumping water up a hill and dropping it down again. And there are various other solutions as well. In this webinar, I'm not going to go into those solutions, but just bear that in mind as we go through, that I'm not being specifically technology focused here. Different storage solutions will address different parts of this market. And because there are so many drivers and different types of storage, one key difference, especially that I find when talking to investors looking at this market versus looking at something like a PV plant investment, for example, is just the sheer complexity of it. It's not a market. There are several market segments, lots of different niches will have different solutions. It's fairly clear, I think, that some of the markets that are most attractive now are not necessarily the ones that will be most attractive going forwards. The economics will change, the market opportunities will change. So it's a very complex set of circumstances, but some key drivers there. Okay, so this is just a chart to illustrate the idea of variability. The text at the top is fairly key. The power system exists to supply and deliver power at exactly the time it's demanded. It's fairly obvious. If I want to drill a hole in the wall, the power that comes to my drill has to be supplied at the exact time that I want to drill that hole. And we've kind of built our power system up and our power markets up conventionally so that demand really is kind of unconstrained. If I want to use my power drill at 5 o'clock in the evening, when at least here in the UK demand is highest, then I can do that, and it's up to the system to sort out how to do that. The main point of this chart, which shows UK power demand over a full year in the blue, with the scale on the left in megawatts, is just how big a variability there is in demand. So there's kind of been a lot of focus on renewables and the variability that they bring into the system, variability of supply. But bear in mind, we've built systems that can cope with a lot of variability. So variability isn't new. And in that sense, even if we weren't talking about renewables at all, if they didn't exist, I'd suggest storage would still be a market that would be of interest in a conventional power system, because the variability, some of the problems it can solve around variability are solvable whether you've got renewables in your system or not. Now, obviously, if you add a variable supply, which in this case is the UK wind generation zigzaggy curve at the bottom, if you add a variable supply on top of variable demand, then your storage market becomes even more attractive, because unless the wind is going up when your demand is going up, if they're going in opposite directions, then it just exacerbates the problem you have, this problem you've got to try and make sure that at a single point in time you're providing enough power with enough demand. Okay, so in the past, of course, that variable demand we met using flexible supply. So you'll hear the term dispatchable power plants. We would have some plants that would run all day and all night, things like nuclear, and we have some that we would turn up and down very rapidly to manage to cope with those peaks and troughs in our demand curve. So in some countries that might be hydro. In the UK, a big chunk of that will be gas. There's various different types of gas generation. You could have diesel generators. There's various ways we can do it, but effectively it was by burning fuels, and the more quickly we could change the output of those plants, the better flexibility they gave us. So there are some conventional plants which are not very flexible. There are some that are. But again, it's this idea of being able to match and have flexibility is not new. In the future, of course, if we were kind of a real renewables optimist and we were saying let's aim for a system where it's all renewables or very high percentage of renewables, then if I scale that wind generation curve up progressively over years and years, we start to run into more of a problem as that scales up. Because what we're adding is particularly if we think of solar and wind, we're adding, if you like, inflexible supply. So if we've got demand, which we're saying is inflexible because I can do what I want when I want, and then we've got supply which can do what it wants when it wants, then that's all heading for a rather inflexible system. So we can add more inflexible supply, but we're going to have some other solutions which can do that balancing. And storage is one of them. It's not the only one, but storage is certainly emerging as one of the ways that we can potentially cope with that. Okay, and that showed a year. A lot of this idea of understanding the different market niches for storage and for other flexibility solutions, and for understanding how the market will segment, is around time. So this is just focusing in a little bit more on a few hours. There are two charts here, basically. There's a blue curve, which is what it's called load following, which is showing demand going up gradually over a period of hours. That's referring to the scale on the left. So it's going up from kind of just over 3,500 megawatts up to more like 4,000 megawatts over a period of, in this case, 4 hours. Now, superimposed on that, of course, is a very short time frame, but much smaller scale, what we call regulation. So demand varying up in this case by about kind of 30 to 40 megawatts up and down, superimposed on that general rise during the morning. And again, the system we've had for years before renewables existed has had to be able to cope with this. We've been able to match supply with demand on all timescales. We've got to be able to do it over our year. We've got to be able to do it over a few hours. We've got to do it down to seconds or less. Now, there's a key point here in that, again, if we're talking about timescale, the shorter the timescale we're talking about, these very sharp ups and downs, then the smaller the scale we're talking about in terms of changes in power, and in terms also then of changes in energy. And again, that's going to be very significant for our different applications of storage. So we're going to have some things that bottom the red curve we could smooth out using storage. We could store at times when we've got slightly too little, and we could again release at times when we've got rather too much. And we could smooth that out with a relatively small capacity of storage. In this case, our maximum up and down is, as I say, 30 megawatts in each direction. Clearly, to start to smooth out something like the blue curve, to flatten that out over long periods of time, we're going to need much larger amounts. So it's a kind of fairly obvious point, but particularly when we look at different systems like, for example, battery versus pumped hydro, or in future there are some new compressed air energy storage systems and so on, and lots of others beside that. One of our considerations is going to be time frame. If we're talking about shorter time frames, we can actually achieve quite a lot with smaller capacities of storage. If we're going to start doing things on long time scales, then we're going to need more. If we went back to that previous chart, if I pop back to that, you'll notice I've pointed out the seasonal variability here in the UK. To flatten out that seasonal variability would be an enormous undertaking in terms of storage capacity, which again is going to bring us to the idea that storage, we can do some things, but maybe we can't do everything, at least not just now. So again, just a couple of examples illustrating this idea of inflexibility of supply. This chart and the following one both look at kind of 2 or 3 day periods in Germany. So this one is from Christmas week, actually last year, 25th to 27th of December. And what you'll see, the key points here are the coloured blocks refer to the scale on the left. So that's the supply mix in effect, and it's just broken down into wind in the green, which is by far the biggest chunk of it, and over those few days a little bit of solar during the middle of the day, and then the grey towards the bottom is kind of large conventional power plants. And in Germany, when they've got lots of renewables in the system, they tend to export quite a lot. So you've got a negative import balance. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the price. There's actually a couple of curves on there, looking at 15-minute prices, both on a if you like, a spot basis and a continuous average basis. They refer to the scale on the right in euros per megawatt hour. Now, what you'll notice, this is an example of negative pricing. So on the left-hand side of that chart, which was Christmas evening, Christmas day, sorry, about 11 o'clock at night, very low demand, but we had an awful lot of wind in the system. And what's happened is the prices have gone negative, and they've gone quite a bit negative, down to kind of minus 75, I think, at the lowest point. So again, you're having to pay people to take it. So that's an issue of inflexibility, because you've got not much demand, you've got an awful lot of inflexible supply, wind, which you may as well take because it costs you nothing. It's not like burning fuel. It's free fuel, if you like. And also the other issue of inflexibility here is that you could say, well, why not just turn that conventional supply down? The other problem we've got what's called a bunch of must-run conventional power plants. Now, some of that is must-run because of the economics of running it. It can be more expensive to turn it down just briefly than to keep it running and pay people to take the power. But also there are some other issues in keeping the system operating. We'll talk briefly about things like frequency response in a couple of slides' time. So there are some grid services that are spinning conventional power plants are having to supply into the system, which means that we can't turn them off. But clearly that's not a great situation to be in. I mean, I've seen lots of people looking at negative prices as a good thing. Look, doesn't it show how cheap power can get? I would say the short answer is it actually shows how inflexible the system is. You don't want to be saying that, look, my power's worth less than nothing, I'll give it, and not just give it to you, I'll pay you to take it. So that's inflexible supply, where we've got low demand, too much supply. It's also important to note that when we think about putting more renewables into a system, people often focus on, well, what happens when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, will the lights go out? Actually, this issue of oversupply is likely to be as big going forwards and growing going forwards as the issue of undersupply. And that's again down to the low capacity factor of the sources that we're building. To create the same amount of energy over time, we have to build an awful lot more solar and an awful lot more wind than with some of the other previous conventional resources. So we're going to have to get used to these situations where we have too much supply at times of low demand. And then, of course, the opposite of that is here. So just a couple of weeks later, same market, we've got a completely different looking chart. Again, the green has pretty much disappeared. We've got very, very little wind, a very quiet, calm week. We've got periods of high demand. Again, that's the scale on the left, and then the scale on the right showing the price. We've got some real spikes in the price, that one that I've kind of arrowed towards the left-hand side of the chart, going up around the kind of 250, 300 euros per megawatt hour range. So again, it's the polar opposite. We've got time of high demand, we've got very little wind, so what we've had to do is we've had to turn up more of our conventional plants, and in particular we've had to turn up some of our peaking plants, which are going to be very expensive to run, and also because in the previous chart they've been and other times when we've got lots of renewables in the system, which we take first, they're not being required to run. When we call them up, they know that they're kind of a last resort, so the prices tend to go very high. So that's two examples within a short period of time where lack of flexibility has caused economic issues, so negative pricing and real spikes in peak pricing. And so that's one of the things that is driving interest in storage. What would be great, of course, on the long term would be able to, if we go back to here, take that wind, store a chunk of it, and then deliver it in this week. We could smooth out smooth out those prices because we could use a bit more conventional supply in the previous week and then not have to bother with our peaking supply here. So that would be a kind of long-term shifting, but also you can see that these spikes in price are actually quite short. So there's actually quite a lot we could also do on a short time frame within a system like this to smooth out some of that demand. In particular, peak power becomes very expensive when we call on it at short notice. So we could have storage which is relatively short time frame, which if it allowed a bit more notice to call on other types of plant rather than turn on the most expensive ones in a very short period of time, again, that would all contribute to smoothing out at least those power plant prices. But they're just examples of inflexibility and drivers towards this storage market. And then another key change that we've seen with renewables, which I'd mentioned actually briefly before, is this idea that instead of having a few large power plants in the middle of the system, we've increasingly got power generation towards the edge of the system. Particularly looking at the box at the bottom, where we've had problems with this is in the distribution networks and specifically around solar. If everyone's out at work in the middle of the day but the sun's beating down on their house, we tend to get lots of supply at the edge of the network where people aren't. So there's no demand. What happens is that power has to go somewhere, it gets forced into the network and it causes local problems, voltage problems within the network. And there are various ways around that. You can upgrade distribution lines, but that's pretty expensive. Or we can look at things like storage. It makes obviously logical sense to store that solar energy when nobody's there to use it and then deliver it back out of a battery when they get home. Not only does that seem logical, but it also helps mitigate some of these issues and reduce some cost in the distribution network. So we've seen these kind of problems in again, markets like Germany, also markets like Hawaii, for example. Okay, so this chart is just summarizing some of that, in particular this connection between different segments of the market and time. So the scale along the bottom is going from very, very short time frames right up to very long time frames. And so in terms of terminology, you'll sometimes hear when people talk about electricity storage, you'll hear them splitting into power applications and energy applications. And so energy applications are kind of the longer time frame applications in terms of moving energy about. So what I've called here further down, the wholesale market's energy scheduling. That's about saying, okay, this time tomorrow we need this amount of energy to be delivered. How do we deliver it? And storage might have a role to play in there. If we know that the forecast is to be very calm and we've got no wind, we might want to shift, we might want to collect energy today and then deliver it out of storage tomorrow. Traditionally, that energy scheduling obviously we've done by scheduling different conventional power plants in the most economic way we can to provide at the right time. And so those kind of applications, the revenue that projects are going to get, the business cases for those are around energy sales. So you're selling megawatt hours. But actually there's a whole bunch of other applications within the grid, what we call power applications. And in particular, you'll hear this term ancillary services. And you get paid for those. And ancillary services are not around shifting big chunks of energy around on longer timescales. They're around short-term things. And as we saw earlier, short-term applications involve less volume of energy movement, less power. But they're all about power at this exact moment. And a lot of those are driven, if you like, not by, it's kind of like the difference between planned, so the stuff on the right, you could argue is kind of planned energy, planned power, whereas the stuff on the left is more about kind of unplanned things. It's things like faults in the grid, a power line gets struck by lightning. It's about unplanned losses of supply. A power plant, a turbine breaks and it goes offline and suddenly you lose a few hundred megawatts of supply. And those kind of very short-term imbalances create challenges, particularly system-wide around frequency. So in Europe, at least, our grid runs at 50 hertz. If you're in the States, it'll be 60 hertz. Now that frequency has to be maintained at all times across the entire system, and basically frequency varies if there's a difference between the power being pushed into the network and the power being extracted out of it by end users. If you're pushing more power in than is being driven out, the frequency goes up. If you're trying to suck more out as an end user than is being pushed in, the frequency will drop. And system operators have to keep that frequency within very tight tolerances, within very small limits, and they do that because those things can happen on very short time frames by, again, having systems in place, and in particular conventionally power plants in place that could adjust their output very quickly, and it can be anything from down at the second, ideally sub-second time frame, up to, for frequency control, tens of seconds, 30s of seconds. You'll hear different acronyms. So in the UK, for example, we call kind of sub-second frequency control enhanced frequency response, and then we have what we call firm frequency response, which allows variations over slightly longer time frames. Now again, all none of this is new to storage or new to renewables. All this stuff has been happening for years in the network. We've always done it. So we've had frequency control and, again, voltage control, which is more local on a very short time frame. In between that very short time frame stuff and the kind of day ahead, if you like, long-term energy scheduling, we've got what we call reserves. So again, if a power plant suddenly drops off the grid, if we lose some supply, as well as immediately adjusting to make sure that the frequency is in balance, the short-term way of doing that might not be the most economic way of providing energy over a longer period, say 30 minutes, an hour. So we have other power plants, often in standby mode, which we can draw on as reserves, or power plants that can turn up their output as reserves over longer periods of time. So these things aren't new, but what's important to recognise is certainly the ones on the left, because they're often about unplanned outages, problems and so on, which can have very high costs, have quite high values. People earn quite a lot of money from selling ancillary services. It's not all about selling energy. And storage can play across that whole thing. Batteries in particular are very fast reacting. So you've seen, certainly here in the UK, that enhanced frequency response has been quite good for battery providers, because batteries can go to their full output in milliseconds, so very quick responding. You're also seeing in battery storage can also play potentially into things like reserves, into slightly longer term coverage of problems. And then, as we've said, in the long run, ideally, if we could get batteries and other storage systems, pumped hydro already does in some markets, to play into this energy scheduling. If we can store at times of low demand and then use storage instead of some of our more expensive peak plants, they can play into that energy market. So that, as a kind of summary picture, I think hopefully that's quite a useful one in terms of the different timescales we're talking about, which are very varied, and also the different sources of revenue. There's one other acronym on there that I don't think I mentioned, which is this FCDM. That's Frequency Control by Demand Management. Now that's important. That's, again, it's a kind of UK acronym, but the same kind of thing will appear under different names in different countries. The importance of that is that now that's recognising that, whereas in the past we've tended to focus on changing supply to cope with all these supply-demand imbalance problems, that's by definition demand management. It's recognising that demand flexibility is going to be important going forwards to solving some of these grid problems. Now that brings us neatly onto this next consideration, which is that where storage gets particularly interesting compared to how we've done things in the past, is that in the past we've done a lot by varying supply. storage is not just supply, it's not just a source of power generation. In fact, all the storage is an extra step between you generating something and then supplying it to an end user somewhere. We've already mentioned it can be large or it can be small. You can have huge scale pumped hydro systems down to very small scale battery systems. But the key thing for storage is that as well as being generation, so when you're discharging a battery or you're letting water out of your pumped hydro system, it's generating power. But equally, storage can act as a source of demand. So to put energy into storage, you've got to charge your battery or you've got to pump water up a hill. And so it's kind of unique in that sense that it's both a source of generation but also a source of load. So storage can actually play not just into management of supply, so variability of supply, controllable supply, it can also play into markets which value changes in demand. You can also have it as a source of load that you can turn up if need be or turn down if need be. So in that sense, again, that places storage in a rather different sort of and rather unique market segment compared to, for example, a diesel generator or a gas peaking power plant, because it has some extra advantages. It's not only, depending on the technology, can be very, very quick to react, but also it can react in both directions. It can provide more power, but also it can suck power out. It can increase the amount of demand if that's a desirable thing to do. For example, when you've got too much wind. Now again, a couple of other caveats to mention. Because it's just a step between generation and end usage, it obviously isn't an additional source of energy. So whereas a gas peaking plant is burning fuel, but adding more energy into the system. Storage isn't, of course, because any energy you discharge into the system is energy that you've used up by charging in the first place. So it's not reducing the overall need for energy generation. In fact, because it's not 100% round trip efficient, it actually increases it slightly. In that sense also, it's if you're building inflexible power generation, which you need to time shift, you're not reducing the need for that capacity. You're not saving any capacity. You still need to generate, you're just generating at a different time and then moving it to a time when it's more useful. On the other hand, it may reduce the need for some of those peaking plants. So as long as, so then you at least have the option to generate your energy using sources you might prefer for whatever reason, because of low carbon, because of cost in many countries nowadays. So solar, wind, for example, you build lots of those, you move the power with storage. That can reduce then your need to have, if you like, backup peaking plants sitting around doing nothing most of the time and then just being called on when there's no wind. And as we said, it can also reduce the need for grid capacity. Again, the key thing, both of those bottom ones, is that we've kind of grown up in a world where the system capacity has all been sized around peaks. It's all been sized around, we need to build more capacity to meet this peak demand. We need to build more grid capacity to meet the peak amount of power that's flowing through the lines. And most of the time, that peak capacity is not being used. Again, it's a bit like building a road for rush hour. Most of the time, there's hardly any cars on it. So it's not the most efficient way of spending money. So in that sense, those bottom two are really about using storage to provide a much more optimized system. So it's not just about improving, for example, the economics of some of our inflexible supply, but it can also potentially be around reducing the overall costs and improving the economics of the system as a whole. Again, the storage isn't the only way of doing that. There are alternatives as well. There are some issues that arise out of this kind of new market position for storage, the fact it's both supply and demand. I'm not going to read through all these now, but these will be very, very much according to your country, the regulatory position policies in your country, and I would suggest that they are already and will certainly continue to evolve and get sorted out. But the key thing is that countries often, energy regulators have tended to have quite specific rules about what they call a generator. It might be different sizes of generator. In the UK, for example, there are problems if you're a distribution network operator in terms of being able to have generation in your system. There are limits on how much money they're allowed to make from non-core activities. So there are various things around that. Now, obviously, we've said that storage has some particular advantages if I'm a distribution network operator. So on the one hand, I could save quite a lot of money in terms of upgrading my network if I could have some batteries, for example, at substations within my network, but I might be prohibited from owning those batteries because I'm not allowed to be a generator, and there are times when that storage is generating. That's one example. Again, there are rules in countries about transmission operators and what they can do as well. There are also rules about how people get paid or pay for using the network. So again, this is a common one as well, or has been highlighted as a potential problem, is double charging. So if you're attached to the distribution network, if you're a big energy user here, you get charged for usage, not just usage in terms of the amount of energy used, but also things like demand charges, capacity charges, and so on. So if you're a battery and you're seen as a source of demand, which we said it can be, then you could get charged those things when you charge your battery. But also generators get charged for grid usage as well. So when you're discharging your battery, you get charged again. So there's issues like that. How do you treat kind of double charging? Or do we look at storage as both consumption and generation and charge it for both? Do we create some separate policy mechanism that kind of separates it out because it is unique from some of the other things on the market? And also, what market is it playing in? So the example at the bottom of the electric cars, when you charge your car, you're paying retail prices, but if you sell energy into the grid from your electric vehicle, the idea of vehicle to grid, then why should you get retail for that? Surely that's a wholesale. You're no different than another power plant selling into the grid. So again, some of those power differentials, price differentials, how are they going to be treated? So the whole policy side it's definitely evolving, and it's definitely going to move, and I suspect it will over time become much more storage friendly, but there are some barriers currently along the way. And then in terms of tying up what we talked about in terms of those various applications over different time frames, what that obviously leads to is there's a whole variety of different business models. I guess, again, it varies according to where you are. The kind of top group here, the ones I've grouped under kind of system flexibility and balancing, there are kind of short time frame, but potentially quite high value applications. High value because if you don't do them and you have grid failures, then there's massive costs. Almost the value there is it's kind of a reliability charge, if you like, that you're taking advantage of. Whereas then maybe the next two, the kind of energy users moving energy about to avoid peak times, that's kind of more mid time frame. That might be a kind of daily time shifting thing. And then at the bottom, potentially you've got quite long time frame shifting. I guess you can't really generalize it. There are certainly ones where you're kind of moving. If you're on energy services and you're moving things about, really the economics are going to depend on the cost of energy, and not just the cost of energy at one point, but in particular differences between costs of energy at peak times and non-peak times. So there are some markets, Australia for example, where prices have been going up very, very rapidly. And storage at a domestic level, there's already quite a big market for storage at that level. Whereas here in the UK, I would say, I mean, you're starting to see there's a few early kind of domestic battery storage offerings, but it's kind of very much early adopter. I think the economic case for it is pretty much unproven, or at least if you're doing it to make a return, you're probably going to be waiting quite a long time for that return. So I mean, obviously as costs of storage come down, that price differential will also can be smaller and still make sense. So again, so different markets, the top ones, most markets I've looked at, these are in terms of driving growth of particularly batteries, and a lot of the real interest over the last couple of years, the real growth in kind of new battery-based systems has been playing in that kind of market. It's been solving the short-term, high-cost and therefore high-value issues within markets. How do you balance power on shorter timeframes, either in response to faults in the grid or to power plants going round, or to avoid paying very expensive peaking plants to generate energy. If we go right down to the bottom, of course, then that's where it gets more difficult. So, I mean, that energy shifting over long time periods. Again, in most markets, the average difference between peak and non-peak is often not quite there to make that make sense. And of course, one of the other challenges in doing that on a long time frame going forwards is that the more successful storage is, you would hope that over time you'd smooth out those prices anyway. So that's going to be interesting to see how that develops, the whole arbitrage energy shifting side of the market. On the other hand, as we saw from those demand curves earlier, arguably the top bit of this picture, which might have the highest value now, in the long run is the smallest bit of the market. We're talking about moving quite small amounts of energy around. The big gains in terms of our system would be if we can have big blocks of energy moving from yesterday to today, from periods of high wind to no wind. But again, so there's the challenge there is the stuff that today might be a very attractive market and have high value may not in the long run be the biggest market. That remains to be seen. But also it kind of just makes the point this market is very, very complex. There are lots of different applications. It's very segmented, and different technical solutions and different business solutions are going to fit different applications. And in particular, there's a lot of interest in this term revenue stacking. It's a common term, especially with recent battery projects where costs are still relatively high, and one way to try and make the economics work is not just to solve one problem, but to solve multiple problems, to sell not just one service, but also sell multiple services on top. And you're starting to see it happen. So this is just some examples. The UK had a enhanced frequency response auction in the summer of last year, and battery projects are very successful in that. And this is just making the point that 4 of them also then, so 4 projects that already had contracts to provide frequency response, also then gained contracts to provide capacity. So the capacity market auction is not about that short-term fluctuation. This is more about at peak times having capacity in the system to avoid using peaking power plants. So there are some projects that have kind of won contracts in 2 places. So there's lots of interest in that, and again, revenue stacking, you'll see all sorts of kind of models and all sorts of reports looking at how that adds up and whether you can do it. There are all sorts of issues to consider. Obviously, you can't, if you've contracted to deliver one solution, then if you find your battery's flat having delivered that one, then you're in trouble if you've also contracted to deliver another one. And certainly ancillary market services will come with very stringent penalties. If you've promised to keep the grid running at a time when it needs it, and then when it contacts you needing your power into the system and you've not got any, then you face quite big penalties for not doing that. So I guess what I've seen mostly with these is that projects, the business case has been built around a core, a single application, but maybe with other ones added later on. Sometimes they might be that the core contract is a very short period of time, and then they're looking at things they can add on at the end, or there are projects where they've started with this, they've set up the business and they've built it based on one revenue stream, but also while that's running, they're also piloting other things as well. So there's various ways. It will become important, I think, revenue stacking, but I think it's at that point where people are still kind of trying to learn technically what you can do in terms of the software optimization and the management, and then also practically what you can do in terms of the penalties that exist, the contracts that you've signed, and also things like how it affects your warranty, particularly for things like batteries. Some applications might require much faster discharge rates than other ones, and discharging is going to affect the lifetime of the battery. So there's a whole bunch of technical and economic barriers still to be solved, I think, about revenue stacking. But as a way forward, it's certainly the way to, it's certainly what I think more storage projects will do. And not just battery storage projects, but I mean, any storage project, again, could look at different ways so that when it's not being used for one service, it can be using itself for something else. It's about getting the most value out of the assets, the infrastructure that you've built. Okay, how are we doing for time? I better crack on a bit. Really, the next few slides, I'm not going to spend much time on these. They'll be there when you download, when you get access to the recording, which Green Power Academy will send you an email around that, how you can download it later on. It's just 4 examples of, in this case, utility scale. So they're between kind of 50 and 100 megawatt sized projects. And I'm showing them really on the basis that they're all very different, to highlight how segmented and how variable this market is. When people talk about storage, unless you know what application you're talking about and things like where the storage is located, it's very difficult to make direct comparisons. So I'll just quickly run through these, won't take very long. This one is in Australia, obviously, as per the map. It's co-located with a PV plant. So this, in this case, the idea here is that in South Australia, they have peaks of demand really driven by air conditioning on hot days. And what you've seen is that the demand on hot days can be much higher than the average on a normal day. And what that's producing is a few problems. One is a lack of peaking power. Another one is high prices at peak times. And so the rationale behind this project is fairly straightforward. It's very much around providing an alternative to peaking power plants. So it will save solar energy during the middle of the day, which is when you've got the most output, and it will deliver it at times of peak demand when the prices are high. And in this region, the prices actually aren't right in the middle of the day. They tend to be more kind of late afternoon. So this is very much kind of, you're not buying power when it's low, but you're holding back some of your PV output when the price wouldn't be too high, and selling it when you can get a much better price for it. So it's driven by the price differential in the wholesale market. So that's 100 megawatts, 400 megawatt hours. Very different. So still quite big, 48 megawatts. This one is on the in Germany, on the border with Denmark. This one is much more about those short-term fluctuations. So it's designed to compete in what's called a primary reserve market in Germany. So helping them solve things like frequency fluctuation and so on. It's interesting because as a location, it's a location in Germany where they've got lots and lots of wind power coming into the grid. And then it's transmitted down from there into further into Germany where more of the demand is. Now it's an interesting one because as well as this primary reserve application, they've also got a pilot that they're going to run on that, which will allow wind farms to put energy into the battery when there's surplus. So when you've got these issues of negative pricing, instead of that power being worthless in effect, you put it into storage. It stops things like curtailment, it stops things like overloading of power lines. So again, it's its primary purpose, the reason it's being built, first and foremost, is to sell into the kind of frequency play market, high value there, but it's also being looked at in terms of revenue stacking, other benefits on top of that. Again, location-wise, it's just making the point, the previous one was locating storage at a generating site. This one is locating storage within the network. And then in terms of location, going completely the other way, this is, again, it's 50 megawatts. It's a big scale storage problem, but this is actually locating storage at customer sites, what we call behind the meter. And so it's not a single 50 megawatt battery. This is a fleet of very small or quite small battery projects which can be operated as if they were one resource, as if it was a single battery. And it's the control of that is over to the utility, Southern California Edison in this case. And they're using it because they've got a put in their network which is constrained both in terms of network capacity, the capacity of the lines, but also in terms of their peaking capacity, their ability to produce power at peak times. Again, the cost of doing that and the capacity available to do that. And this is much more than around storage and its ability to vary demand, because what happens here is that at times of peak demand, instead of SCE turning on more expensive peaking generation and overloading the grid, they're basically instructing those batteries in those business customer sites to get power out to the battery. So those sites will use power from storage rather than power from the grid at times of peak demand. So it's not replacing, it's kind of peaking avoidance, if you like. It's a good example of this idea that rather than just constantly produce more, you actually avoid more. There's also benefits for the end users because they can avoid some of the demand charges and some of the peak usage charges. So again, it's in that sense there's a stack of different benefits. In this case, not even just for one player. There's advantages for the utility, and there's also advantages for the end users who are hosting these battery systems. So again, it's quite a good example. So that, I mean, that's 3 battery examples which are all sort of highlight the variability of this market. They're all big, so they're all utility scale battery systems, but they're located in different places and they're achieving different things. And again, just before someone screams at me that it's not all about batteries, conventional pumped hydro, this is actually the first pumped hydro scheme in 30 years, I think, here in the UK to be given consent for construction. Again, similar size, 99.9 megawatts, which is interesting, so about 100 megawatts. Much longer time frames, 7 hours of storage. Again, it's using abandoned quarries in this case, so 2 reservoirs, you pump water up and down between them. Much different business prospect. So they're expecting payback over 15 years. Now, if battery developers I've talked to are talking more in timescales of a few years. So it's a very different payback, and also longer to build, 3 or 4 years of construction, as opposed to some of the battery projects now are being rolled out very, very quickly. Also very, very long life. Good luck with a battery lasting 125 years. So again, just to make the point that it's not all about batteries. I think we will start to see innovation and new sites for things like pumped hydro as well. And in many people's eyes, in terms of solving some of those long-term energy shifting applications, much more relevant. Okay, I'm aware I'm kind of gone on a bit. I'll just leave you with this one. Again, just to make the point, I've talked about storage. It's a webinar about storage, so let's be bullish about it. But it's important to recognise it's not the only way of doing things. It will compete and it will coexist with other solutions. Interconnection, moving energy about, not between storage and out of storage, but between markets is one way of, if you've got too much supply in your market, shift it somewhere else. I've mentioned demand management. That can be with or without storage. Simply getting people to turn down or change behaviour has got a big potential. Curtailment, we do it now. There's a point at which, rather than put energy into storage, lose some of it in the round trip and try and sell it again, it's just more economic to curtail it. It's just the fact of life. So that we'll still have potentially levels of curtailment. Flexibility of supply. Again, we talked about distributed generation as being kind of a renewables thing, but you're starting to see, if I look at the UK, for example, some of the flexibility, some of the capacity market contracts are going to things like distributed diesel generators, so modular generator sets. People in nuclear are keen on growing things like small-scale modular nuclear. So I think you'll see this idea of small-scale and supply flexibility not just restricted to renewables. Other conventional generators as well are looking at kind of smaller scale ways of adding supply. And then there are other things you can do in terms of with smart inverters and so on, which I don't think I need to go into here. And then finally, storage, which is not electricity back to electricity, but if I look at the UK, or if I look at other parts of Northern Europe, anywhere with a cold climate, really, we use far more megawatt hours of energy as heat than we do as power. So one possibility here would be that when there's far too much wind, which tends to happen in the winter, which tends to be when we're all chilly and cold, would be to convert power to heat, and not then convert it back to electricity, but just use it as heat. So what I've called energy substitution. Again, there's some interesting projects going on in terms of managing that kind of thing as well. Okay, I think I'd better call it a day there. I have one or two questions. Let me just have a quick look. Okay, so I'm just having a quick flick through the chat thing for the questions. I've just been asked to remind you again that you will get the slides available at the end with the webinar. You'll get sent a link, I guess, for that. Okay, I've got 3 questions which I may or may not be able to answer. Let's have a look. Reduction in grid capacity has only really been mentioned, not entirely explained yet. Is this from its ability to provide reactive power support or reduction in peak transfer capacity? Okay, yeah. There are, obviously, when we're talking about grid capacity, it kind of depends where in the grid we're talking about. If we look at, for example, if we take something like large-scale wind power plants, they tend to be built in places away from centres of demand because it tends to be windy places where people don't necessarily want to live. So you can end up with quite a lot of capacity supply built in areas of the grid where the grid, if you like, is inherently weak. It's not been built for great big power plants. It's in more remote regions. So that's one. So you can have capacity simply because as you add on more supply, more wind farms into an area, the grid may not be able to cope with those when they're all blowing at full tilt, when the wind is at maximum. Now, the question will be, well, why not just upgrade the grid capacity? And the short answer is that there is a point at which it's just too expensive because that peak wind production might only happen on relatively few occasions. So it's back to this idea that do we constantly upgrade capacity for just a few hours, or are we better, as on the slide I finished with, just curtailing it? And there's a point, up to a point, it's as economic to just turn off, just curtail that wind, not take it, as it is to where storage comes into play is that when the wind is blowing at full tilt, rather than upgrade that power line, there potentially also becomes a point where it's cheaper to build storage at the wind farm, put the energy into your storage, and then you can, if you like, let it out through your grid capacity at a slower rate, so you don't exceed the capacity on the power line. So that's one example. On a distribution level, again, same issue. If you've got too much solar generation on rooftops and it's still trying to push it back into the grid at one time, that particular example is a bit more relevant to, you mentioned about voltage fluctuations, reactive power, and so on. Now, I don't think there's, I'm not going to go into reactive power, I don't think now, but it's some of it's about peak transfer capacity, and some of it is about kind of instantaneous balances. That's where the reactive power thing comes in. I don't probably not explain that terribly well. Question 2, blah blah blah. How would react to electricity prices in a highly storaged flexible market? I guess the prices, at least the peak ones, will be reduced downward. Yeah, I mean, that's, I kind of touched on that slightly. That's one of the interesting challenges, I think, for storage, is that certainly at the moment, if you look at some of these storage projects that are being built, it's very much, if I was to go right back in my slide stack to here, I've said that if you've got negative prices, that's a good time to fill your storage, because you get paid to charge your battery up or to pump water up a hill. And then if you get very high spikes in price, that's a good time to emptying it. So you've got a very big price difference between the two, so you can make money. But yes, absolutely. If in a perfectly flexible system, you wouldn't expect, you certainly wouldn't have those big spikes in prices. If you could move electricity around perfectly to match demand, then I guess we could have an economics discussion of how flat that becomes, but certainly you'd end up with much smoother, much less difference between times of peak demand and times of non-peak demand, because you're just kind of moving the same. You'd be potentially supplying at the same cost and then just moving it in time. And in that sense, the more storage you put into the system and the more you smooth out those prices, the less attractive that market then becomes for moving them around. So it'd be interesting to see. I kind of guess you will end up with some kind of natural balance. Now, also playing into that, of course, is the cost of storage. As the cost of storage comes down, that price difference doesn't have to be as big as it is now in some markets to still make storage make sense. It also plays into other ways of paying for these things. Do we pay based on energy? What you're seeing in some markets is that with things like capacity markets, where people are being paid not to provide energy but to provide guaranteed capacity at peak times, what we may see over time is that the cost of our electricity has a bigger proportion of payment which is based around capacity than is and a shrinking proportion paid around energy. But certainly, yeah, you would expect to lower peak prices, and also you would expect to remove, ideally, some of those negative prices, so that arbitrage becomes a bit more challenging. What kind of battery examples are installed in the given examples? The three I showed at the end, the three examples are all lithium-ion batteries. I think there was a figure I saw recently for, it was looking specifically at the US, but it was something like 97% of battery storage projects, I think, were lithium-ion in the US last year. There are other batteries, obviously. There are flow batteries, there are sodium sulfur batteries. You will see other types of battery chemistry as well. I've no doubt about that. There's an awful lot in research projects, and it's all ultimately going to be around cost, scale, performance, and so on. Okay, I think that will do. Jamie, I'm sure, from Green Power will be back in touch with you. You'll be emailed the webinar, the link, and so on. I hope you found it useful, and thanks for listening. Okay, goodbye.